Have you ever felt like the universe slammed a door in your face and unlocked every other one behind it? Like the thing you thought defined your future was suddenly ripped away, and all that remained was a long, dark hallway with no clear way forward. That's exactly where Franklin Delano Roosevelt found himself. But this story doesn't start with a tragedy. It begins with a boy privileged, yes, but uncertain, searching for meaning. Franklin was born into wealth in 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. His family owned sprawling land, and his parents, James and Sarah Roosevelt, raised him with every comfort a child could have. But comfort doesn't forge character. That comes later. For young Franklin, the world was a safe place, predictable and polished. He was the only child, doted on by a strong-willed mother who shaped much of his upbringing. His father, older and often ill, became more of a distant figure than a guiding one. Franklin grew up surrounded by rules and rituals, first at home, then at Groton, an elite boarding school where discipline and duty were practically scripture. It was there that he first came face to face with failure, not in grades or prestige, but in belonging. He wasn't the brightest, he wasn't the most athletic, he wasn't even particularly popular. But he was observant, and quietly, something started to grow inside him, a desire not just to fit in, but to rise. He went on to Harvard, following in the footsteps of his cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Rider, the president, the hero. Franklin admired him, envied him, and wanted to be like him. At Harvard, he was charming and ambitious, but not exceptional. He edited the school paper. He shook hands with the right people. But he didn't light the world on fire, not yet. He briefly attended Columbia Law School but dropped out. He wasn't passionate about law. His heart was in something bigger, public service. And even though the world wasn't watching yet, Franklin was quietly preparing to walk a much harder road than even he could imagine. At just 28, he entered the political arena, winning a seat in the New York State Senate. He didn't just blend in, he made noise. He defied party bosses. He challenged the machine. He stood up when others stayed silent. The wealthy boy from Hyde Park was becoming a man who fought not for his class but for his convictions. People started to notice. Then came the call to Washington. President Woodrow Wilson appointed him Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a role his cousin, Theodore, had once held. He traveled, he negotiated, he learned the gears of government. His name was gaining momentum. Whispers of a future presidency weren't far off. And during all of this, there was Eleanor. She wasn't just his wife. She was his partner, his conscience, his mirror. Their marriage wasn't perfect, far from it. But Eleanor believed in something deeply. The power of compassion, of justice, of service. While Franklin maneuvered politics, Eleanor challenged his perspective. And when the storms came in, they would come. She would become the force that refused to let him drown. Then, at 39 years old, with 4 children and a political career soaring like a kite in the wind, Franklin went on a vacation to Campobello Island. It was supposed to be a retreat, a moment to breathe. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare. He woke up one morning with a chill. His legs ached. Then came the weakness. Within days he was paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors diagnosed it as poliomyelitis. Polio, the disease that didn't care about your wealth, your name, your dreams. And just like that, everything stopped. Can you imagine? One day, you're a rising star. The next, you can't walk, can't stand, can't even hold your child without struggling. For a man who had always believed in control, in strength, in forward motion, the silence of his own body was deafening. There were no motivational quotes that made it easier. There were no everything happens for a reason cliches that comforted him. There was just pain, confusion, and shame. He retreated from public life. Friends came to visit. Most left worried that his career was over. Some even suggested he disappear quietly, let the younger generation take the torch, and who could blame them? In that era, disability wasn't just a health issue. It was a social death sentence. A man in a wheelchair wasn't seen as strong. He wasn't seen as a leader. He was pitied or worse, ignored. Franklin's world shrank. The halls that once echoed with opportunity now felt like cages. His children saw him struggle. Eleanor watched him suffer, and deep down, even Franklin began to wonder. Was it over? Was this the end of the story? But it wasn't. Because here's the thing. When everything else is stripped away, your status, your strength, your reputation, what's left is who you really are. And that's when the fight truly begins. Franklin Roosevelt didn't stand up by himself. He couldn't. But he rose in spirit. He began to work with therapists, forcing his body through agonizing routines. He studied every muscle that still responded. He clung to every flicker of hope. Not because he was sure it would work, but because the alternative was surrender. And surrender, that was never an option. When they said he'd never walk again, he didn't accept it. He taught himself to appear standing with braces, with canes, with hidden scaffolding under suits. When they said the public would never accept a disabled leader, he said, "Watch me." He rebuilt his life with the same force he once applied to politics. Only now, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about votes. It was about dignity, identity, purpose. And through it all, Eleanor was there, visiting places he couldn't, listening to people he couldn't reach. She became his eyes and ears, his voice when he was silent. She believed in the man behind the pain. Franklin once said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." But before those words moved a nation, he had to believe them in the darkest corners of his own soul. He had to stare into the abyss of lost mobility, confidence, certainty, and say, "I'm not done yet." He didn't let the chair define him. He let it refine him. It stripped away the easy wins. It burned off the entitlement. It forged a fire that would later lead a broken country out of depression and a war-torn world toward hope. Because that's the lesson. The greatest leaders aren't made in comfort. They're forged in the fire of their failures. They rise not because they're fearless, but because they face fear head-on and move anyway. Franklin Roosevelt's story didn't end with paralysis. That's where it started. That's where the man became the mission. Have you ever felt like you're rebuilding your life with broken pieces, trying to construct a future from what feels like ruins? That's where Franklin Delano Roosevelt found himself. Not metaphorically, not momentarily. After being paralyzed by polio, he had every reason to give up. Every reason to disappear into the quiet shadows of history. But instead, he did something extraordinary. He decided to rise. Franklin Roosevelt didn't just come back. He reinvented himself. He reshaped his identity, his mission, and his purpose from the ground up. But it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen alone. After polio robbed him of the ability to walk, Franklin was broken physically, emotionally, and spiritually. But he wasn't defeated. He refused to accept that this would be the end. So he began looking for hope, not in the halls of power, but in a small town in Georgia, in a place called Warm Springs. There, in the mineral-rich waters, Roosevelt found something unexpected, not just therapy for his body, but healing for his spirit. He saw other people, ordinary people, struggling with the same limitations. He wasn't special there. He wasn't a politician. He was just another man fighting for a second chance. Day after day, he worked, stretching muscles that didn't want to move, teaching his legs to mimic the motions of walking. He designed his own therapy routines. He experimented. He failed, and he tried again. He poured himself into the illusion of mobility, not for vanity, but for dignity. He built the image of a man who could stand, even when he couldn't walk. He trained himself to support his weight with braces and crutches just long enough to appear standing before a crowd. He wanted people to see strength, not pity. Because that's what true strength is. It's not about never falling. It's about standing back up in the only way you can. Warm Springs became more than a place of healing. It became a symbol of transformation. He purchased the facility. He invested in making it a haven for others who, like him, had been told their lives were over. And in doing so, he found something even more powerful than medicine. He found meaning. And while Roosevelt rebuilt his body and spirit, one person never stopped believing in him. Eleanor Roosevelt was never just a first lady in waiting. She was his strength when he had none, his courage when he doubted himself. While Franklin battled polio in private, Eleanor stepped into the public spotlight. She spoke, she advocated, and through it all, she kept Franklin informed, connected, and inspired. She became the bridge between his retreat and the world he was destined to re-enter. But Eleanor wasn't the only one. A few close allies like Lewis Hownever gave up on the idea that Franklin could return. They believed in his mind, his charisma, his rare gift of empathy. They reminded him that his voice still had power, that his ideas still mattered, that the world still needed him. And so, after years of grueling rehabilitation, Franklin made a decision that stunned many. He would return to politics. In 1928, he ran for governor of New York. People doubted him. They whispered behind his back. Could a man who couldn't walk lead the largest state in the country? But Franklin wasn't focused on what he couldn't do. He was focused on what he could. He campaigned with fire. He projected confidence. And above all, he hid nothing of his condition, never allowed it to define him. He won. As governor, he faced a new kind of war. The Great Depression had begun to claw its way through every corner of the nation. People were losing homes, jobs, and hope. The American dream was crumbling, one breadline at a time. But Roosevelt stepped into the crisis with clarity and compassion. He launched relief programs, fought for unemployment benefits, and used every ounce of his authority to ease suffering in New York. His leadership was bold, unapologetic, and personal, because he understood pain. He understood what it meant to lose something vital. He wasn't leading from theory. He was leading from experience. And the people saw it. They didn't just see a politician, they saw a survivor. Someone who had been knocked down and had crawled his way back up, 1 inch at a time. That kind of resilience doesn't just inspire, it ignites. By 1932, the entire country was desperate for change. The nation was drowning in despair. President Hoover's administration seemed distant, disconnected, and incapable of compassion. And then came Roosevelt, with his broad smile, his booming voice, and that unshakable optimism. He didn't campaign like a man who had lost. He campaigned like a man who had learned. He traveled the country in cars and trains, speaking to people He delivered speeches not full of policy jargon, but full of purpose. He didn't promise easy answers. He promised effort, action, hope, and everywhere he went, he brought the energy of someone who had walked through fire and lived to tell the tale. He famously said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." But that wasn't just rhetoric. That was personal truth. He had known fear. The kind that comes when your body no longer obeys. The kind that comes when your career seems over, when your friends doubt you, when you question your own worth. And yet, he stood before America beaming, unshaken, ready. The press called him the happy warrior. And that's exactly what he was. Because Roosevelt had discovered something most people never do. That your wounds don't weaken you. They prepare you. They sharpen your empathy, fuel your vision, and remind you of what matters. And he didn't run from his disability. He mastered the art of perception, not to deceive, but to empower. He would approach podiums, walking, leaning on aids, or the crowd would cheer. Cameras were politely discouraged from filming him in his wheelchair, not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted the world to focus on his mind, his message, and his mission, not his condition. And it worked. In November 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected the 32nd President of the United States. Think about that. A man who had been told he would never walk again, never lead again, never matter again was now the leader of the free world. Not in spite of his pain, but because of what he became through it. Because adversity doesn't just test you. It teaches you patience, perspective, compassion. It teaches you what kind of fire burns inside you when everything else has gone cold. Roosevelt's journey back to the presidency wasn't a miracle, it was a mission. And every person watching this right now has a mission too. What do you do when the weight of an entire nation rests on your shoulders, and your body is already broken? Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew the answer, because for him, pain wasn't new, uncertainty wasn't new, but now, the stakes were far greater. This wasn't just about walking again, it was about pulling millions of Americans back to their feet. When Roosevelt took the oath of office in March of 1933, the United States was a country drowning. Banks were collapsing, unemployment had skyrocketed. People stood in breadlines that stretched around blocks, mothers cried over empty dinner tables, and entire towns faded into silence. And there he was sitting tall behind the podium, legs braced and hidden beneath the desk, but voice clear, heart full, spirit unshakable. His first words as president struck like lightning. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. In a moment of darkness, those words lit a spark, and then he got to work. In the first 100 days of his presidency, a stretch of time that has become legendary, Roosevelt passed more laws, launched more programs, and moved more mountains than some presidents managed in a full term. It wasn't politics. It was rescue. The New Deal became the engine of national recovery. Massive public works projects gave jobs to the unemployed. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work in forests and parks. The Works Progress Administration rebuilt bridges, roads, schools, and hope. For the first time in a long time, people didn't just feel like numbers on a graph, they felt seen, they felt remembered. And that wasn't an accident. It was leadership, and it was personal. Because Roosevelt knew what it felt like to lose everything. He knew what it meant to wake up and not know how you'd survive the day. And that empathy, that fire forged in personal suffering, became the soul of his presidency. But it wasn't just the policies that made him unforgettable. It was the way he spoke to people. The way he made a whole nation feel like he was sitting right there beside them. Every week, Americans would gather around their radios to hear him speak. Not with grand speeches, not with distant formality, but with warmth, with conviction, with words that reached through the static and wrapped around the human heart. They called them fireside chats, and they were revolutionary. Imagine hearing your president not as a politician, but as a friend, someone who didn't just talk at you, but with you. Roosevelt explained complex economic challenges in plain English. He shared victories. He acknowledged pain. He didn't hide from the hard truths. He met them head-on, and he brought the nation with him. He once said, "The presidency is not merely an administrative office. It is preeminently a place of moral leadership." And moral leadership is exactly what he delivered. But the tests weren't over. Just as the country was finding its footing, a storm was brewing overseas. Fascism was rising. Nations were falling, and a Second World War was beginning to smolder. Many thought America should stay out of it, but Roosevelt knew better. He saw the danger on the horizon, and once again, he led not with fear but with resolve. He began preparing the nation, building military strength, forging alliances, and rallying the people not just with plans, but with purpose. And when Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared it a date which will live in infamy. With that, America entered World War II. But here is the part most people forget. While leading the most powerful country in the world through the bloodiest conflict in human history, Roosevelt was still paralyzed from the waist down. He still needed help to move, to stand, to present. He was in constant pain. His health was deteriorating. And yet, the world never saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, because leadership isn't about walking tall. It's about standing firm in the moments that matter. Through war councils, global strategy meetings, and somber letters to grieving mothers, Roosevelt remained a symbol of steadiness. He worked with Churchill. He confronted Stalin. He navigated a world ripping itself apart and never let go of the belief that democracy, freedom, and unity would win. And the American people, they followed him. So much so, they did something they'd never done before and haven't done since. They elected him to a third term, then a fourth. No president before or after has served that long. Because Roosevelt wasn't just a president, he was the heartbeat of a nation. But behind the public triumphs, his body was failing. He was tired, his heart was weakening, and still, he gave everything he had to the cause. He didn't stop. Not until his very last breath in April of 1945, just weeks before the end of the war, he helped win. But his legacy, it didn't die with him. It was carved into the soul of a generation. Social Security, one of the most transformative pieces of legislation in American history, became a permanent lifeline for millions. The protections, the reforms, the rebuilding it. But perhaps his greatest legacy wasn't a law or a program. It was the redefinition of strength. Roosevelt proved that a man who couldn't walk could carry a country. That a man fighting his own battles could still lead others to victory. That a man told to step aside could become the greatest leader his nation had ever known. And if you're hearing this right now, if life has handed you obstacles you didn't ask for, pain you didn't deserve, trials you didn't expect, remember Franklin. Remember the man who sat when others stood, but who stood taller than any of them. Who turned paralysis into power, adversity into action, suffering into service. He once said, "When you come to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on." So hang on. Whatever you're facing, you can push through. Whatever's been taken from you, it does not define you. Whatever storms rage in your world, you have more strength than you know. Because greatness isn't built in ease, it's built in effort. It's not about how many times you fall, it's about how fiercely you rise. Roosevelt rose, not because he was free from pain, but because he believed he could still make a difference. So can you? Your obstacles don't disqualify you, they qualify you. They teach you, they mold you, they prepare you to lead, to love, to lift others. Don't wait for the perfect conditions. Don't wait to feel ready. The world doesn't need perfection. It needs you, your fight, your voice, your fire. Be like Roosevelt. Speak with courage. Lead with compassion. And when life pushes you down, rise anyway. This is your moment. Your history is still being written. Make it one worth remembering. Welcome to a place where stories aren't just told. They ignite something inside you. This channel is dedicated to real people, real struggles, and real triumphs. From underdogs who changed the world to leaders who rose from the ashes, we bring you powerful, cinematic storytelling that fuels your belief in what's possible. Here, you'll find stories that remind you, rejection isn't the end. It's the beginning. Failure isn't defeat. It's the foundation of greatness. And no dream is too big when you refuse to give up. We don't do clickbait, we do purpose. We don't just tell history, we bring it to life. To help you write your own. Subscribe now if you're ready to turn your pain into power, your setbacks into comebacks, and your dreams into legacy. Because you're not just a viewer, you're a story in progress.